Thank you, Brett. On a trip down Highway 24 on Friday, I passed, once again, under the regular Stop the Steal sign near Orinda on the overpass. And after my initial reaction, which is always, really, still? I became aware of the tension in my body. I thought to myself, well, there you go, another slide for the service on Sunday. This is, of course, a sermon about how we are trying to navigate in this time when so many of us are realizing that the truth is being used a little bit like a soccer ball, and when we're so divided that we can't agree on what's true and what's not. So that slide, the last one that we saw, that you might have needed a little moment of breath for afterward, is among the other signs of the times, many of which are hard expressions of things that really need to be said. Today, I want to talk about how we communicate with each other in this time, this strange time for which there is no roadmap. The discernment that we're called on to do almost every day, often multiple times a day, moment by moment, to think about how to live our values in the face of these times, to live our values into evidence, if you will. We have always had to choose our responses to a rude, crude, and indifferent world at some level. And now we're facing this post-pandemic, increasingly climate change disrupted world, and we know we have a lot to figure out. Perhaps before the last few years that we've just been through, we thought we lived with sort of a general agreement about what truth was, that it was evidence-based, and that there were these things that we called facts, which sometimes it took longer to convince people they were there, but eventually they rose to the surface. Prior to 2016, many of us took a certain comfort, even amid divisiveness, that over time truth would out, as the saying goes, and people would understand that the needs for basic rights, to end basic human endangerments and inequities must be addressed. That science would show us all facts that people would come to understand over time. And now we're just not quite so sure. The excesses of an inadequately regulated capitalism combined with inadequately regulated false news choices and other sources of misinformation now are all being protected under the guise of our First Amendment to our Constitution. And it makes us, well, it certainly makes me less sure that truth is going to be noticed in its quiet and unassuming forms, which makes us feel that we need to keep talking loudly. And at some levels, we do. Those who have been waiting to be treated with basic human rights, the right, for example, to stay alive in one's own neighborhood, have been feeling that too. Last spring's uprising after the killings of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd and others is just an example, and many of the signs that we saw in that slide deck just now came from those demonstrations, which had frank speech in them as well. And still, our neighbor in Antioch died. So let's take a breath. I would like to say that after I got out of my car on Friday, after seeing people on the overpass again, that I had taken a moment to breathe or maybe do a few quick yoga poses. I did not, though. I just plunged right back into work. If I could do it again, I might have taken a moment just for mountain pose or Tadasana, just that regular pose of great composure and stability, because it feels as if the world where truth is optional is one in which we constantly need to be calling ourselves back into stability. The question that I want to explore for us today, and it's a complicated one without a simple answer, I'll just tell you right now, is how do we engage in right speech in an era of false news, hate speech, and cancel culture? Wait, you might be saying, I need some definitions here. So what is right speech to begin with? Well, I took the title of this service from one of the steps along the Buddhist Eightfold Path. It's a series of practices, including right speech, right livelihood, right action, etc., that in the Buddhist tradition represents the embodiment of the core teachings of the Dharma, and ways that you can exercise those in your day-to-day routines. For right speech, esteemed teacher Thich Nhat Hanh says we need to do a couple things. First, refrain from falsehood, not speaking with a forked tongue, which means not saying one thing to one person and another thing to another, and not speaking with cruelty. And it's the last one, which feels like such a conundrum in these times. When we are listening, because that's the other part of speaking, right? When we are listening and speaking together, those of us who would transform ourselves and our world into something a little bit more just, a little bit more kind, can spend a lot of time talking about what we see as heinous, what we see as ridiculous, what we see as imbalanced in the speech of those who wish to return the world back to a time when they felt that they were more safe, even though others did not. When they didn't have to think about the damage that's being done to many lives or to our planet to protect the status quo of a privileged few. False news is unbalancing. The divisiveness means that there's a level of cruelty going back and forth that is also showing up as a rise in hate speech. The Human Rights Campaign reported last fall that the FBI had identified an alarming rise in hate speech, with almost 1 in 3 targeting Black people, and a rise in the percentage aimed at LGBTQ folks as well. Recent reports have surfaced about crimes targeting Asian Americans here in the Bay Area, and many are about more than just right speech. There are actually acts of violence against elders that have been occurring as well. After having a hater-in-chief for 4 years, many of us, especially those most threatened by these attacks, are angry and vengeful, and it feels like this is the time for us to have our say. We know that we need to speak out against especially false news because it can be deadly. We know this in the very fibers of our being this week when our president marked more than 500,000 dead from this COVID-19 virus. A virus whose importance was denied, and the false news is now that the reality of these incomprehensible deaths is being questioned. And we live with the outcomes of false news in the shortage of vaccines because it turned out that not enough were ordered for our nation to fully be protected. The attacks on the Capitol, though others would have us forget them as quickly as possible, are still also held within our very beings right now. So we have a right to be angry and to want change. And yet, we also have to ask ourselves on a regular basis, how do I act and how do I speak? I said, because my discernment needs to be about me. So I use the pronoun I, because my location really determines where I might need to speak about a particular subject and the circumstances. One of the things I rewatched again in preparation for this particular morning was a dialogue that was recorded between Reverend Angel Cota Williams, a Buddhist teacher, and the second Black person to be ordained as a Buddhist teacher, sensei, and Kozan Greg Snyder, and they talked about this issue of the Dharma and truth and right speech in these times. And well, they come from the same engaged Buddhist tradition as Thich Nhat Hanh, one that I've often felt is the one that most closely parallels our values and our tradition. And of the statements we might make, Williams said, we need to ask, what is going to flourish out of what I say that is just? Sometimes we have to say things for justice to flourish, and sometimes we have to say things that are not what people consider nice, especially if it's about a system. And sometimes we don't need to say things, and that's the discernment Williams invites us into. Williams points out that the dominant supremacist culture is a binary culture. If we have right speech, then everything else is wrong and our attacks on it are justified. Really confronting how deeply engaged that was for me was part of a deep interrogation I had to go through, she admits. Not just what I think, but how I think of them. For those of us who are committed to not recreating the same paradigm just because we might be the ones with a little more power, we really need to think about reframing. We have to be committed to deconstructing the narratives and ideas that make up the ways we are pursuing justice. Williams is driven by a deep idea of justice, and she wants transformation, pointing out that 2019 marked 400 years since the enslavement of African peoples here in the United States, something we should remember in this last day of Black History Month. She asks, what does justice look like for this year one and going forward if we no longer want to have a mindset that comes from peoples that had never had justice for all of us in mind? If we're really committed to reframing, we have to be committed to deconstructing, as she said. She notes the speed and aggression with which those wishing for a kinder world, as soon as they become aware of their transgressions, clearly and quickly turn on shaming and marginalizing other people. Evidence that we are shaped by those cultures and that we will, unless we are conscious and interrupt this cycle, just keep recreating a different world with power over, with different faces. She believes we need truth-telling. And she believes in using hard words like supremacy, because that describes the culture that she sees herself living in. There are no simple answers here, but she believes, and I believe with her, that we have an invitation to discernment. And that brings me to the slide in the deck, which you may have just passed right over, but which always makes my stomach churn a little bit harder. It's the one that says ABAC. That slogan, which I first heard marching in youth-led marches as all cops are bastards, was pretty uniformly uttered by white people in the marches that I was in, mostly young white males. In the protests, I found myself very unsettled by this, wondering if this was truly an appropriate approach to this uprising. It's an extreme statement and can't be factual at face value, as my own personal experience of knowing many good-hearted people in law enforcement means. But in a movement that I consider to be, in fact, evidence-based and factual and vital, I found that there were this group of people using this, and it seemed to me to be a great example of the other side of right speech. And then I started to do some research. And I found that what I took as just some expression of overexcitement in this time was actually a movement phrase that comes out of the 1940s and the labor movement in Great Britain. It was actually another cultural indictment talking about systems of policing, though again, the wording in my mind was perhaps not the best. It was not an intentional identity, such as labeling oneself queer or black or as a person of color. And the fact that it was used so often in the hands of young white men made me think of it as an example of what scholar Audre Lorde calls the master's tools, pointing out that they will not dismantle the master's house. I was going to use this as the perfect example, and then, of course, it turned out it was not. It is true that it is a phrase that in my personal discernment, I would not put on a sign and carry. But then again, I would not also carry a sign that belittles a national leader as a person, even if he were an inciter of hate. I might now understand much better than I did 5 years ago that our systems of policing are grounded in protecting the property of those who have the privilege of property and are inherently biased because they have a lack of foundational respect for human rights. And yet I would not condemn all human beings in that profession in that way. For me, that would be my discernment. You might make another decision out of your context, your experience, and I would be interested in hearing that, because this is all very complex. Williams reminds us that a more accurate translation of right, for example, in the phrase right speech, right livelihood, etc., is thorough, and invites us into a time of thorough discernment, to examine the ways that we are perpetuating a culture that says some are unredeemable. The excesses and polarizations in our dominant culture mean that we have trouble with the nuances. People are either right or they're wrong. They're either good or they're bad. And the reality is it's all much more complex than that. Our culture has had to witness so much, seeing children in cages, knowing how many black bodies have been in cages for so many years, seeing the dispossessed lining our streets, knowing that we need to make our voices heard, and now we must do so amid and above the din of false news. Sort of the way that I tried to make my voice heard about the din of our friends, the turkeys, during our observance just a little while ago. But even on our couches, even among friends, we can perpetuate these divisions. So if you think that this particular discussion is going to give you one easy answer, I'll just tell you again, it will not. We, as people of a discerning faith, inherit a very tricky conundrum, and that is that we do not believe in what Snyder calls irredeemability, the belief that some are not capable of being saved. Evidence may tell us that some are probably not worth the effort, and yet if we hold this in our heart, then we are schooling ourselves in fear, prolonging the othering that our deepest beliefs oppose. The disempowered claim their experiences, and they claim the right to voice their anger. Those who were poor in England felt the system that protected the propertied was so corrupt that they could name it this way. Those who experience discrimination from dawn to dusk in a system white-centered name the attitudes they see. Those who find their identities denied by a cisgendered heteronormativity in a culture claim their own words. And yet, what is now in another sermon, I will say that Me Too and other movements have shown the importance of naming abuses of power in strong and public ways, because the culture of politeness and niceness is too biased towards the status quo. As people who gather together in a religious community, we can hold this discernment together. I would love to see us spending more of our time together speaking about the places where we're in conundrum, rather than the places where we just want someone to reaffirm our viewpoint. That would be part of that internal interrogation, what others might call moral discernment. The laws aren't going to protect us. They say we can say false things, at least to a point, and our lawmakers have affirmed that this is true even when people die. Though we might enact laws to reduce disinformation from news sources, more than a quarter of the people in our nation get their news from YouTube and self-anointed messengers. This makes passing life through the fire of thought a lot harder than it used to be, and it makes it more important that we do this, that we make our own decisions, and that we think about where we are, about what kind of world we are working to create, and how we claim our own way. Writer Malcolm Gladwell talks in his work Blink about the way that stereotypes and prejudices are a shortcut for us to get through our days without having to discern every single thing. And it is true that I have talked to very many people in the course of doing work to widen the circle of who we see and who we honor, who've said, just tell me the one right thing I can say so that I never offend someone. And the reality is, that is not possible to do. Maybe, perhaps, we all need to remember that one of the rightest speeches we can make is a simple phrase, I am sorry. In these ways, we can keep on learning and engaging. We need to listen, especially to those who've been most dispossessed. We need to speak our own truths as we know them. We need to challenge systems designed to serve only some and dismantle systems that truly take the lives of others. We need to be sure that we don't inadvertently perpetuate harm by being aware and educating ourselves in an ongoing way. But if you are a commuter and you see someone on a Friday afternoon on the side of Highway 24 in a mountain pose, well, it might be me. Or actually, Reverend Angel Williams says that we need to go back to a related pose, which is samshiti, which means equitable balance. It looks very much the same, except it's all about taking the time to be sure the weight is balanced on the four corners of each foot, spreading each toe, being very sure that your balance is equitable. We can't do this every moment. We can't find this intentionality every moment. But in this world in which we face incomprehensible losses every day, including the loss of the familiar, we can invite ourselves into a more equitable time, a more equitable balance, and we can do so with our greatest intentions.